I'm also really hoping that one day I'll be able to sit in my rocking chair and say that I helped, or at least did not hinder, the beginning of careers of the people who will be the great array language implementers of the future.
Welcome to another episode of ArrayCast. I'm your host, Connor, and today with you we have a repeat guest that I will announce in a second. But before we do that, we'll go around and briefly do quick introductions. We'll start with Bob, then go to Stephen, and then go to Rich.
I'm Bob Therriault. I'm a J enthusiast, and I'm now involved with building a J wiki, or rebuilding a J wiki, which is a challenging thing, and we're making some progress with that, but more about that later.
I'm Stephen Taylor. I'm an APL from way back and currently the KX librarian.
I'm Rich Park. I'm an APL evangelist and working on training materials, tutorials and such, and I work for today's guest at Dyalog Limited.
And as mentioned before, my name's Connor. I'm your host, professional C++ day-to-day, but in all my free time, array languages and combinator enthusiast at large. And excited to talk to our guest today, who we had on previously, but didn't really delve into his personal background. But before we introduce him, we'll throw it to Bob, who's got a couple short announcements, and then we'll hop into today's interview.
I'll be really quick. We have been working on the JWiki, and one of the things that this podcast, actually people on this podcast were pushing us into, was trying to develop something like Try APL, which is what Dyalog does, which is really cool, and it's a quick way to get access to APL through the browser. And J didn't have that. And now we're in the process of putting together the front end we've actually got J running in JavaScript, which means you don't need to download anything. You just fire up your browser and you can run J, which is really quite a big deal. And lots of work by Will and John and Joe and John and lots of people have got that put together. So that's been really good. And the other thing is I'm looking for feedback. I put a video up on an introduction to J last week, and it caught a little bit of attention, but I am looking for feedback for it. So in the show notes, then there will be show notes, and there will be a transcript. Actually, last week's guest, Rodrigo, mentioned that we probably should be mentioning this off the top, that we have show notes and we have transcripts, and we can be reached at ArrayCast.com. And having done all that, now I've taken up far too much time, and back over to you, Connor.
Awesome. Yeah, that'll be exciting. I think the tryapl.org is actually how I basically ended up falling in love with APL, because I heard about it on a podcast once and went and Googled it, stumbled upon it, and having like a web-based REPL that you can just start playing with, I think is really lowers the barrier to entry for any language, whether that's APL, C++, J, etc. So awesome that that's going to be coming for J soon. With all that said, today, our returning guest is Morten Kromberg, the former CXO and current CTO of Dyalog Limited. I apologize for all the times in the past I've referred to the company as Dyalog APL, which is not the name of the company, but I always interchange the two. Morten's going to be bringing us back in time to talk a little bit about his time at Sharpe Associates, and then his time currently at Dyalog Limited, and then also we're going to talk a bit about the future of Dyalog Limited and APL. So go as far back in time as you'd like to, and super curious to hear what you have to say today.
Okay, thanks. It's great to be back. I'm in awe of the work that you guys do. I'll come back as many times as you ask me. So I'm going to go back even before Sharpe Associates, tell a little bit about how I discovered APL. It started off very promising. I was born in 1962, which is the same year that Ken Iverson published A Programming Language. But right after that, my parents whisked me off to a country called Botswana between South Africa and what's now Zimbabwe. And I grew up there with, I think, an AM radio, probably the most advanced tech in the house. But when I was 15, I was back in Norway about 1977, I guess. And at the end of high school, I got a basic course for 2 weeks as part of a math course. And shortly after that, I noticed in the local newspaper that the first Commodore Pet in Norway was on display in the biggest department store in Norway. Downtown Oslo, only a 20-minute tram ride from my house. So I headed down there, and curiously, the department manager let me sit and play with it after school pretty much every day for months, presumably because a kid sitting in front of it made it look a bit less intimidating. It looked a bit, I don't know if you've seen pictures of the Commodore Pet, it looks a bit like sort of a white Darth Vader helmet perched on a box. So I spent months learning basic wrote a Moonlander as one does game. And I spent so much time there, even today, I remember the taste of the chocolate milkshakes they served in the restaurant at the department store. After that, I wanted my own machine. So I started getting hold of little 6502 or Z80 based machines and doing hand assembled programming. I played with an HP calculator that taught me that reverse Polish was really not what I wanted to do. And then I started a really big project. I bought something from the UK, a Nascom One, which was a kit that arrived in a box with a single printed circuit board and little bags full of resistors and capacitors and integrated circuits. And I had to do 3,000 solder points. And for a kid who just bought his first soldering iron, that wasn't really a good project. It did boot up, but there was a dry solder somewhere, which meant that every time I hit the reset button to return control to the debugger, a random column of RAM was corrupted. And when you have no way to save and load programs, you have to type it all in again. That's a bit discouraging. So I don't know why I still enjoy coding to Electric Light Orchestra's New World Record, even though that's what I was listening to then. So somehow I enjoyed it. But then APL arrived in my life, fortunately. In 1979, a Canadian company called Sharpe Associates, who were involved in the initial APL 360 implementation for IBM, and were now offering APL time sharing on mainframes located in Toronto. They were sending one or two people out to very many capitals in Europe to set up data concentrators so that large corporate clients like Rank Xerox and Kodak could do reporting via local dial-up lines into the IP Sharpe network. So they got email and reporting applications. And the crew who arrived in Oslo for Sharpe Associates moved into a flat that my dad was moving out of, and I helped them carry some furniture. And they heard I was interested in computers, and they said, "Why don't you come down to the office?" And they showed me, the 1, 2, 3 plus 4, 5, 6 that we've heard about so many times. And, I remember a small wow, but, nothing impresses kids. I just sort of concluded that this was a natural progression, right? There's assembler, and then there's basic, and then there's APL. And pretty soon basic would be history, I presumed. And now more than 40 years later, I'm still puzzled about the state of the universe. But I fortunately managed to use APL ever since then. So, I wrote my own adventure game, and perhaps the least useful program ever written, a very, very partial basic interpreter written in APL. And today I still feel that those couple of years there where I was just messing around is where I actually learned 90% of the skills that I have to this day as an APL programmer. And a funny story from that time, I actually managed to sign up a time-sharing customer for Sharpe Associates during that time. There was a lady in the horoscope business. I don't think I'll call her an astrologer, but she noticed me playing with a PC at some show. And she had a book with a basic program listing in it to compute planetary positions, and asked if I could implement that. So I typed in these 50 pages of basic code, but the resulting planetary positions were all over the place because the basic interpreter on this machine used single precision arithmetic. Unless you forked out the cache for the floating point coprocessor, which cost about as much as the PC had cost to begin with. But curiously, the serial I/O adapter cost an order of magnitude less. So I figured out I could write the code in Sharpe APL and then just have the basic interpreter dial up and type in the birth coordinates and get the planetary positions back, consuming 10 cents worth of CPU time, and then producing a report that was sold for $10. So that was good business for for her, and probably not very interesting business for IP Sharpe Associates. But that was my first taste of client-server computing, I guess, back in 1979 or something like that. And then there were a couple more years of where I was essentially an item of furniture in the IP Sharpe Oslo office. They let me come and go as I please and make coffee. But eventually they decided they could rent me out to customers. So I did things like, back in Norway then, they were modeling the profitability of North Sea oil exploration. And I also wrote a crew scheduling system for an airline. Everything was made by hand back then. It was a wonderful time to be a programmer. And so I finished high school and I tried studying maths and computer science, but really struggled with motivation because working for IP Sharpe was just so much fun. I even tried tricks like moving 500 kilometers out of Oslo to Trondheim and the Norwegian Institute of Technology to get away from the IP Sharpe office. But of course, the airline with the crew scheduling system just flew me down south when they needed tweaks to the system. Until one day I showed up to a meeting with them in a tracksuit, and the head of IT decided that it was too embarrassing to have them relying on something written by a kid, and he'd better take care of it. But that's how I remember it anyway. And I'm telling this story. And at that point, sort of a big change. Gitte Christensen, who was on a few episodes ago, explained that she imported me to Denmark. But there's a little bit more to it than that. In fact, I used data mining. I used APL to data mine Gitte. Because at that time, IP Sharpe Associates was entirely managed by email, perhaps one of the first companies in the world to be driven that way. And I was stuck there alone in the Oslo office, miles away from anybody else. And I decided that in order to find out what was going on in the company, I needed to write a program that spooled the entire email directory out to file once a week and then do a diff. Because then I could see which email groups had been created and who had joined the company. And in addition to the who is function that the email system had, I could write a who was function that would tell you about people who were no longer there. And suddenly one day I noticed a very interesting looking person only 500 kilometers south of where I was. And the IP Sharpe system had a text messaging facility, the write paren MSG system command. And shortly after that, Gitte did import me to Denmark. It is the girls who call the shots most of the time anyway. So I got to Copenhagen. I tried to resume an academic career there, but although I learned Simula in Oslo and Pascal and COBOL in Copenhagen, we got pregnant and I finally had the excuse I needed to abandon my academic career, which I, to be honest, I was ill-suited to anyway. Although 35 years later, I did have the pleasure of returning to the very same building that I dropped out of because I was invited back to the University of Copenhagen to give a course in APL to the Futhark team. I don't know if you've heard of Futhark. It's a functional array-oriented compiler. And they realized there were APL people nearby. So that was a lot of fun teaching them APL.
How many people were in that course?
Oh, I think it was, 4 or 5 master students working on the compiler.
Wow, that's so cool. I had no idea.
Yeah, that was fun. The only unfun thing was walking through the canteen and feeling very, very old. Anyway, so at that point, I abandoned academic career. I became a full-time APL consultant at IP Sharpe Copenhagen, and very quickly settled into a pattern where Gitte would talk to clients, understand requirements, and write application code, while I concentrated on building infrastructure and tools, sort of multidimensional databases in APL. And interesting, during that time, we also met Adam's dad, Henry Brudzewski, who was a leading figure in the APL community in Denmark at that time, a consultant like us, not working for IP Sharpe. And we had 2 pairs of children each at pretty much the same time, and we lived near each other, and our families became close friends. And that's part of the reason why, we babysat Adam at APL conferences, and his mother looked after our kids because we were at all the APL conferences back then every year. Yeah, and then so that went on for a while. Towards the end of the time at IPSA, I managed to get to work with the people in Toronto in the Ivory Tower on tools that were used outside the Danish office, like 3270 UI prototyping tools and converters from other APL systems to Sharpe APL, which was something we did a fair amount of at IP Sharpe Associates. And getting to interact with people, well, like Stephen, although Stephen was maybe in Australia at that point, but certainly interact via the email system with Leslie Goldsmith and Lib Gibson and key application developers at IPSA. But then, just as things were getting really interesting at IPSA, it just suddenly disappeared overnight from under our feet as the bottom dropped out of the mainframe time-sharing business. IP Sharpe was also selling their APL interpreter on mainframes at the time, but that people didn't want to use mainframes anywhere near as much as before. And we were all laid off, and IP Sharpe, just from our perspective at least, disappeared overnight.
What year was this taking place in? This was like late 80s, early 90s?
This was 1989.
Okay.
I think Reuters acquired IPSA in 1987 or 88, and then spent about a year deciding to get rid of all the people who were not in Toronto working on databases. Because Reuters, I think Gitte talks much more about this, about how Reuters wanted the historical time series databases that IP Sharpe had collected over a couple of decades at that point. Mm-hmm. Reuters had no historical information. But Reuters was not interested in being a software company. They just wanted the data. So those of us who were doing APL application development in the far away from Toronto, we were all laid off overnight pretty much. It was really funny, actually. I don't know do I have time? Yeah. The being fired by Reuters was one of the most fun things that's ever happened to me, because IP Sharpe was this company where, what was I? I was 20, I don't know, 3, 4 at the time, 5 maybe. And they really didn't want to upset anybody. So they gave us this package, retraining package. And so they asked for our job descriptions. And when I was 24, 25 at IP Sharpe Associates, I had the kind of responsibility that you would have to be one of the, top managers at Reuters to be. I could buy things and take decisions. So they concluded that we were all senior management types, and they gave us this fantastic retirement package with, talking to psychologists and being given guidance on what to do next, and we did it all because it was fun. But then we said, but we're going to form our own company anyway. So essentially, IP Sharpe Copenhagen just continued. We bought all the furniture and continued business the day after as if nothing had happened, because the customers still needed us for a while anyway. So the technical staff of IP Sharpe Copenhagen, which was Gitte and myself and Kim Andreasen, we formed this company called Insight Systems in 1990 and just carried on doing APL consulting, now focusing on workstations rather than mainframes. There was still a couple of years of mainframe consultancy to do where we made just a ton of money, but we could see that was all dying. So early 1990s, you had the arrival of Windows and OS2 and graphical user interfaces, and that was a real worry because it made the existing APL systems at the time really look like dead ends. The first GUI interface for APL Plus really, didn't look promising. It essentially gave APL programmers direct access to the Win32 API. And if you cast anything correctly from APL, that was just the end of your APL session, something that APL programmers really could not deal with, right? A completely untyped language trying to make Win32 API calls is never going to work. So we investigated Smalltalk, which quite a few APL programmers at the time went off and did. but then probably at least half a dozen people I know went off and did Smalltalk.
Really?
Yeah, because it was seen as sort of the nearest thing. If you couldn't have APL, what are you going to do? Well, Smalltalk.
Really?
Seemed like the obvious choice at the time. Yeah, for a lot of people.
That is a crazy piece of programming language lore that in the 90s...
Is it?
Yeah.
You need to invite Romilly Cocking on the show.
Okay.
Because he ran a very successful consulting firm in the UK, Cocking and Drury. And I think they switched the whole company to doing Smalltalk for a while.
Wow.
And he can tell you more. He can tell you about that. We only looked at it very briefly. And we looked at things like, I mean, most of you, well, no, maybe half of you weren't around then. There was Gupta SQL base. And there were tools called Application Manager for OS2. I remember OS2 was a big thing at the time as well. But none of those were really... They didn't turn us on at all. And fortunately, at that time, Dyadic Systems put out Dyalog APL, and we suddenly had hope that APL would be a viable platform for Windows GUI. So we stuck to our guns in, early 90s now, we're talking. But the big problem we had was that we really had skills to do consulting for large companies to do data analytics on their corporate data, is what we'd been doing for the last decade. And we didn't have access to the data. So one of the things that Inside Systems did was team up with a Belgian company called Technosis, who had a product called SQLink, which was, I think, a precursor to ODBC. So they were actually selling ODBC as something very similar to ODBC as a package. Their big trick was connecting Macs to AS400s because nobody else could do that. And we wrote an adapter for APL for that, which we managed to sell to it was available for Dyalog APL, APL Plus, and Sharpe APL. There was a version for APL2 as well, but IBM decided it was easier for them to write their own to get it through the legal department to use our tool. And then later we adapted it to ODBC. It's the same interface that's in Dyalog APL today. The SQ APL interface was built back in the early 90s. And then ODBC was supposed to die, but of course it never did. Well, it sort of died on Windows, but then it became the standard on Linux. It was really weird. Anyway, so we had to invent that tool in order to have access to the corporate data from the workstations. And through that, of course, we got really well connected with a lot of people in the industry, the vendors, and did consulting projects for a lot of major corporations. But we were getting really tired of trying to sell our skills as a small company. So just being a four-man consulting band was really, really tiring. There was always either way too much work or much too little work to do. So we wanted to become part of something bigger. We nearly sold ourselves to Technosis, but then they were acquired by Progress very shortly after. So we're really happy we didn't do that. But then, as sort of related to having become the ODBC or the client server people, we were hired by a company called Adaytum, who had a DOS-based at the time business intelligence package. And they hired me as a consultant to sort of give them an architectural blueprint for how they should move that over and become a Windows system. But halfway through that consulting project, it was abandoned in favor of hiring me as the new CTO of Adaytum and Gitte as the Nordic sales manager. So we then built a company in Denmark with about 25 people who were doing a combination of development in Dyalog APL of this business intelligence package and then selling it in the Nordic region. And that company was driven by an ex-SA Special Armed Services soldier from New Zealand who'd been in satellite TV and now wanted to conquer the world with this. And he had 50% year-on-year growth for 5 years, heading for a NASDAQ IPO. And in the last 2 years, under the loving strokes of venture capitalists who looked at us and told us your R&D budget is too small. It should be 3 times higher. Hire some people. And eventually, we decided to bail out of that. And in fact, just after we'd left, the company missed the IPO because the dot-com bubble burst. So that was in, what was that, close to 2000. They just missed it. But it was, the story had a happy ending anyway, because they sold the company to Cognos for quite a lot of money. And that's where Gitte and I earned the money that we later used to buy our share of Dyalog. There's also a really funny story at the end of Adaytum, which is that Adaytum was sold to Cognos. Cognos was then sold to IBM. And I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but probably something like IBM ended up paying more than $100 million to buy back an APL application, which used to be an internal IBM planning system that they had let the original author, George Kunzel, take with him as part of an early retirement package.
That's awesome.
So, funny story. And they are, well, maybe I shouldn't speak about this, but that system is not dead yet. Yeah, so Adaytum ended, and we spent a few years as APL consultants again in sort of the general market. And a few years later, a couple of the major customers of Dyalog, or Dyadic as it was at the time, felt that something needed to be done to avoid the risk of Dyadic being acquired by one of the major customers. A big oil company in the US was mentioned as a potential buyer. And they were really worried that Dyalog APL would become some internal tool and effectively disappear from the market. So these two companies, Simcorp and APL Italiana, they were competitors at the time, and they teamed up to find new management and to fund the acquisition of Dyalog and then install new management. And that became Gitte and myself. So that's when the story started at Dyalog in 2005.
So wait, what happened? Simcorp and APL Italiana, they didn't. I don't think they acquired Dyalog APL, but it sounded, or Dyalog Limited, but it sounded like.
No, well, they did. Actually, what happened was they approached Gitte and myself and asked whether we could act as headhunters to find new management for Dyalog, because they knew, we knew everybody in the market basically. And I suspect Carlo Spinici at APL Italiana had already worked out what was going to happen, and that we would fail, and then we would fall on our swords and say, well, okay, we'll do it. I think he knew secretly I wanted to do that anyway. So I wanted to get back in the APL business, having started out at IP Sharpe Associates. So we were, absolutely delighted to fail in the search. And get together with APL. So APL Italiana, Simcorp put up about 3/4 of the funds, and we put up 1/4 to acquire Dyalog Limited in 2005.
Oh, I see.
So there were 3 owners at that time. And of course, so that's sort of the beginning of the Dyalog story. The Dyalog company at that time, the APL group of it was actually a company that also had a big IBM AIX RS6000 reseller unit, and it was split up and the parts were sold separately. But the APL side was about 5 people at the time. And obviously our mandate was to start by, replenishing a very small development team, half of which was rapidly approaching retirement age. So we did a road trip. We visited all the major customers. They've told us afterwards they expected that we would just walk into a room and tell them how many months they had to get out of Dyalog APL, because we were acting on behalf of some major company that had bought it. But we explained our vision, and we told them we'd offer services like escrow and support for cherry pick fixes to customer specific branches, and architecture reviews and tuning and re-architecting projects and so on, and changed changed the pricing so that people had to pay for the usage. So before you would just buy a copy of a developer license, but at that time we revised the pricing so that pretty much all the revenue came from support contracts, which are some function of the usage of Dyalog APL at the customer site. So the number of internal users or the number of APL-based seats that they sold of their application, or it was really up to the customers to come up with some number that they already had, ideally, that they were comfortable using as the baseline for the support contract. And there were lots of people in the UK in particular who sort of shouted that the Vikings have come and they're going to loot and pillage Dyalog and it will soon be gone. But in fact, the major customers were absolutely delighted because they were making Plan B, which was going to cost them double-figure $1 million and had a very high likelihood of failure. So the customers were really happy to pay more and to pay based on their usage. And this had the effect of not just increasing the revenue, but also making it very much more predictable, which allowed us to feel comfortable hiring people. So since then, the revenue has just grown fast to begin with, but it's still growing because these companies are successful and selling more seats, and there's a steady trickle of migrants from other APL vendors. It's also interesting, I think, that since that one price adjustment we made in 2006, we have not increased our prices. We have not adjusted them for inflation. So the price of the new 64-bit system that was introduced at the time, which was 50% more than the old 32-bit system, but where that fee included both 32-bit and 64-bit, because most people would need both for a transition period, is the same now in real terms as the 32-bit system cost back then, I think, if you adjust for inflation.
A few years ago with web applications, there was a big outcry when people switched over from buying an application going to subscription basis. It sounds like you guys hit the subscription idea, 15 years ahead.
Well, it was the only way to, and it's fair. I mean, of course, it depends on how big the numbers are, of course, whether something is fair or not. But I think the customers are very happy with what they got.
You mentioned conversion projects, that there's the plan B if they had to get off APL, and you said that there's a high risk of failure in those. Do I recall that you have some war stories from that?
I don't know that I have any I can repeat, since they're all fairly ugly. I mean, some of the customers, of course, involved had already tried this, right? So they knew very well that it was going to fail. And there are other companies who just said, well, so we can get out of APL if we get rid of 50% of the functionality of the application, but we want to do that anyway because of reasons, which may be good or not. But anyway, so in that first few years, we increased the revenue significantly, and we were probably a bit more than a dozen people after 3 or 4 years. And we had the people, we were starting to train the people who would take over eventually from Scholes and Streeter. And of course, we have all of the original people still on the team today, except John Scholes, who passed away, of course. But Geoff is still there. The original implementer of Dyalog APL is still there, working part-time. And even Pete Donnelly, who was the managing director, works on testing and writing parts of our documentation to this day. So, the annual user meetings were growing, and I think in general, all the customers had stopped worrying about whether Dyalog was, we would be there for as long as any of their planning horizons. They started hiring people. We invested in the Bible, the 800-page. I once swore I would never, ever learn a programming language that had an 800-page manual, and then I became a co-author. So Bernard Legrand did most of the work, and a few of us were involved. And of course, now really happy to see Rodrigo doing a proper job of modernizing it. But anyway, so, first 5 years, customers relaxing, hiring new people, thinking about extending their APL systems instead of getting rid of them back in, just before 2010. And of course, having been for the last 15 years before we joined Dyalog consultants and building our own product in Dyalog APL, we also came with a to-do list of things that we really thought the product needed in order to become competitive. So, and with the new developers on board, we could then really start on that. So we completed the 64-bit conversion and the object-oriented features, which those were actually pretty much done by the time we arrived. John Daintree's design, pretty much implementing C# object model in Dyalog APL, because of course at the time it was the .NET framework that was the big thing. If you wanted to do any web programming, you basically wanted to write ASP.NET applications. And John did all the work to allow you to write ASP.NET plugins in Dyalog APL and so on. And therefore the OO needed to be quite closely aligned with C#, or at least that was the thinking back then. And then we added Unicode support very early on, and I'm really proud of that implementation. We used proper character arrays, not UTF-8 strings, and we managed to design it in such a way that existing clients could move over to Unicode almost without making any code changes. And I'm pretty confident we got that right because the Russian clients said it was good. So, and they moved very quickly. And if they thought that, I think that's the ultimate proof. And then, of course, quickly following on from that was putting APL source code in Unicode files, which is something we've been working on for more than a decade. And I still wouldn't claim that we've got it right, but we're getting somewhere now. Tooling for efficient conversion of XML and then later JSON and CSV files. And then sort of towards the end of that phase, I guess 7 or 8 years into the Dyalog story, really understanding the ascendancy of Linux as part of cloud computing and the fact that in the future, probably everything would be Linux and there would be a Microsoft Linux and there is today. So introducing the RIDE and just generally trying to make sure that all the tooling that we put in, so like the CSV, the XML, everything should work the same way on Windows and Linux and Mac if we possibly could. Anything that made sense in all the environments would be the same everywhere. Adding support for secure sockets in our TCP layer. And of course, adding the Mac OS and the Raspberry Pi versions. And then sort of the first little stab at attracting real new users was running the annual problem-solving competition, which also started in that, well, actually very early on in the middle period. And on the language side, of course, us old Sharpies wanted to bring in some of the great ideas from Sharpe APL and J into Dyalog APL, and fortunately managed to connect with Roger, and that was really wonderful. So we could have the best of both worlds. We could have our OO and our floating arrays, but we could also have the rank operator and key and extend dyadic iota to higher ranks and stuff like that. Oh, and futures and isolates also went in that period. So you could have this user-controlled parallelism. That's also nearly 10 years ago now. So that was sort of the expansion phase after the Big Bang, if you like. And then the last 5 years or so, we've started to feel that Dyalog APL is reasonably competitive. You know, you can show it to a programmer of some other language, and they will notice some warts in the tooling and so on. There's much more work to do. But you could really, it was worthwhile now trying to understand how to attract a new generation of users. And interestingly, in the last 5 years, I think it's true that technologically, it's a period where the very biggest customers And the new users, the more technically oriented users, are actually asking us for the same thing. So they want, ways to do cloud computing and continuous integration and all that stuff. And that definitely wasn't true. If you go back 10 or 15 years, there was much more of a disconnect between what the big customers and the new users want. So what have we been doing? Really continuing mostly. So much more investment in this cross-platform development. So making the Ride a really capable development tool. The HTML renderer, which is sort of like, Node.js for APL, where you can pop up a window and populate it with HTML, JavaScript, and works on all platforms. And then deciding how to run Dyalog APL in containers effectively. Making text files for source mainstream, understanding GitHub, and then starting to think about, and this is something where we still have a way to go, project managers, package managers, and so on, things that other programming languages take for granted, where we're just starting to see the first promising tools emerging. And although we can't yet see a way to make Dyalog APL itself open source, and that's something we can talk about a bit later if you'd like, we are trying to publish more and more of the coding, the APL code that we produce. So all the tooling layers that are done in APL under MIT license, typically on GitHub, because we think that that part of what we do works really well with open source, while the interpreter, I think there are good reasons why it doesn't work well. Certainly not right now. Maybe it could in the future. Yeah. And then we discovered through participation originally in functional conf and then later lambda conf that there is nice overlap between some of the features of APL and functional programming. So we've really been able to present APL as a pragmatic, functional, array-oriented language. It's not a pure functional thing, but it's much easier to explain APL and the benefits of array-oriented programming to a functional audience than it is to other types of programmers. They pretty much, they get what you're talking about quite quickly. Because it maps nicely to some of the things they're doing. So we've been putting in function trains and more functions. Maybe that's not really so much functional, but where interval index, at stencil, things that all work nicely. We're doing functional programming. And then we've been, in the last few years, it's really pleasing to see we've managed to recruit quite a few people from outside the APL community and really help start building a modern array community. That's really good. Some of them, you're already there. You're very familiar with Adam, Aaron, Rich, who's here, Rodrigo, who's been on, and, Marshall Lochbaum, who was at Dyalog for a while before he moved on, essentially because he wanted to go faster than we were able to do. And the average age of the Dyalog team has come down dramatically. That's really great. And we introduced the free personal and non-commercial license. And I don't know, Bob, maybe I'll ask you to delete this before publication in a week, but we're actually trying to look now at whether we can create a license where we actually get rid of the non-commercial license and just put a lower fee, sort of a lower limit on the royalty license, so that you can use a Dyalog APL, you can distribute it as you wish up to a certain level of revenue without contacting Dyalog for permission to do that. But we're still seeing whether the lawyers can get that to work. It's interesting. This is actually coming out of deploying APL in Docker containers, because people are creating samples that they want to share with each other. And if you do that via a Docker container, now you're in violation of our non-commercial license, which says you can't redistribute Dyalog APL. And obviously that's a very bad thing. So we want to do something about that. And in general, make it easier to get hold of Dyalog APL. but we can't shoot off our own feet, obviously.
It's a balancing act, isn't it, really? Because you're trying to promote, but at the same time, and I guess maybe this comes back to some of the open source stuff as well, you need to keep proprietary control over that part, which is the core to your company, but you also want to promote, and you do promote other ways, but as you say, you've done it by some of the add-ons, making them open source.
Yeah, well, and making the non-commercial free. I mean, maybe we should, wait a bit and then talk about open source. I think we still have some time. So that's sort of the history of Dyalog up to today. And then, so where we stand today is we've got, compared to the 5 people who were there 17 years ago, there's now somewhere between 20 and 25 people, depending on how you count it, where the company was owned 75% by clients and 25% by management. Back then, it's now 25% by the users and 50% by the management and 25% by the employees, roughly. And, although the clients no longer own the company, our emphasis is still on keeping the existing clients happy because, they're paying for what we do. And we also expect any potential new clients to go and ask the existing users what it's like to be a customer. Maybe that's a very old-fashioned idea these days. People don't do that with software, but we still believe fundamentally in paying for what you use is a healthy way to run society, and that this focus on things being free is actually going to go away again, right? I mean, APL is not here for years or decades; it's here for centuries, and we can talk more about that in a bit. But of course, the existing users understand that attracting new users, certainly now that they've sort of all started to reinvest and they need to hire people, they really need us to work on attracting the next generation and making APL look like a modern, respectable tool. So they're actually happy for us to do that. I don't think they worry that we're not putting enough into the product compared to chasing after new users. So, our intention now is, ramp up the community building. We realize we need to write much more documentation. It's sort of our Achilles heel at the moment, I think, is it's the tool is much better than you can find out easily. And there's actually, there's sort of a historical reason for that, which is that IBM, STSC, and IP Sharpe sold all the new APL systems. And then as their mainframe business or as their businesses started to fade, and Dyadic invested in this technologically superior APL interpreter, people migrated to Dyalog APL, but they all knew APL already. So Dyadic systems never really needed to train new users. They were just served to us on a plate. And so there's this hole in what we're doing. And, that's why Rich is here.
Walking around trying to fill holes, or more accurately, to yank the information out of the existing knowledgeable people's brains and put it into a format other people can find without literally having to ask.
Yeah, and some of it's actually written down. It's just written down in places that you can't find. So that that's a growing part of what we do. But then there's technical stuff to do as well. For version 19, we've just started really talking. So that's the release that will be out in a year. There's the bridge to what, I don't know, Connor, maybe what's the correct term for the platform previously known as .NET Core? Is that .NET 6.0?
I think they're just calling it .NET, yeah. That's just the versions. And
so we have a bridge for the framework, but now we need to sort of rebuild the equivalent for .NET. And we think one of the things we might want to do is to add some language support for async features that have become a very big thing in .NET in the last 5 years or so. I think everything has an async interface now. We're working on revising, sort of fundamentally rewriting our I/O handling to better support shell scripting. We have some shell scripting in the version that's just going out now, 18.2, but you can't attach RIDE to it to debug. And there's all sorts of things that don't work very well with redirected I/O, and that's all part of being able to use Docker containers and in general run headless better. So we've got a bit of technological catching up to do there that will hopefully be in the next release. We've got the 64-bit ARM systems that are now starting to become a thing. So there's the M1 Max, and the Raspberry Pi now I think is going 64-bit. Android, we don't quite know what to do with yet. We're on the fence. Better understand Linux and Mac users, because we started out on Unix and then DOS, and then for 2 decades Windows was where all the users were, and now that's changing again. Linux and Mac or certainly Linux are becoming much more important and are the future, I think. And we have a lot of learning and we have work on keyboards and fonts because Linux users don't seem particularly happy with how we handle that. Maybe that's a more general problem. And let's see, what else? Well, more of the open source APL tools and packages. We really want to open that up wide now and push as much as we can. And I'm also thinking that some of the interface layers that we have that are written in C, like the wrapper we have for the Chromium embedded framework, we might want to open source that so that it's easier for people to contribute to the parts of the system that are moving the fastest and where people might want to port to another platform, and that's hard for us to do. I know we talked about this further simplification of the licensing. I hope that happens now in 18.2, but it may be next release. So that's the next release, and then longer term, we have some sort of bigger things we're working on. We've been struggling for probably a decade to understand how we can work 64-bit integers into our numeric tower. 64-bit integers are currently voodoo because they have higher precision than double precision floating point. So if you round off by saying floor 0.5 plus x, you go to you might have an integer with more than 53 bits, and then it goes to double land, and when it comes back, it could be way somewhere else in the universe, and we have some ideas for how we will introduce, we think, multiple numeric towers. So each array is tagged with whether it's in the fast tower, we call it, which is the binary one that we have now, or the decimal tower, which will include 64-bit integers and our quadruple precision decimal floating points. And then the third tower only actually having one type in it, which is rational numbers. So we have the infinite precision as well. We think we have some ideas for how we can get those to interact in a way that APL programmers will find reasonably easy to understand. But that's more of a long-term research project, 2 or 3 years out at least. There's the literal array notation, which Adam has done presentations on, and I think exists in, I don't know, there are models of it. I don't know if it's in BQN or Zyma's APL. There are models of it in some APL systems or array language systems. We want to get that into Dyalog APL soon. And then there's, the defects and the missing features that are being experimented with in BQN, for example. We know that we need more inserts and folds. We need to figure out exactly what to do.
Sorry, what was the last thing you said? Inserts and folds? Inserts
and folds, right? I mean, the reductions that we have in regular APL are lacking. You've talked about that a couple of times, I think, Connor.
I have?
Jay somewhat recently introduced a few more types of fold. And people who come from the functional land, they know about fold L and fold R and blah, blah, blah. But Dyalog has fold, which does the one type of fold, but also it's slightly weird because of the right to left. But Iverson had his reasons back then. But now the functional people come over and they go, it's called fold, but it's not the same as Haskell's fold, and it's making me confused and angry.
Yeah, and Jay has some of them. BQN has others. I mean, the whole sort of prefix thinking. That I'm not an expert in. You'll get much more mileage talking to Adam and Rich, but it's there is stuff there that's missing, and there's things like the schizophrenic slashes in Dyalog APL, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Connor, if you've been trying to write trains in Dyalog APL.
I'm actually not sure what my number one Dyalog APL request would it be. Would it be somehow fixing that so it's unambiguous, which for the listener that's not keeping up, depending on how you use, like, the backslash is not only a reduction, it's also compress or filter.
Yeah.
And it can be ambiguous, and so at times you need to add a couple extra Unicode characters to disambiguate. So that's one thing, and there's also that BQN uses the logical and an or as in the monadic case for sort. I'm actually not sure which one.
Right, the sort, yeah.
If I could only choose one, which one would I want more? It's a good question. I don't know. I would ask Santa for both.
Watching the ArrayCasts is for me very valuable. I'll probably learn something even when I listen to my own episode. So I mean, we are aware of those defects, and we can't move as fast as the other guys. Jay preceded us by a decade or two. BQN is experimenting. I mean, it's wonderful to have something like BQN to observe, where you can see, well, what can you do if you don't have the backwards compatibility requirement? What could you do? And does it work? And then, we can come along and, the commercial juggernaut sweep up the good ideas.
There's still a lot of things that I pick and choose now when I solve little programming problems. Whether it's Perl, Weekly Challenge, or LeetCode, I will choose the language J, APL, or BQN because none of them have like a superset. So Dyalog APL still has the decode and encode, and also has GCD, which BQN doesn't have. So like if my solution requires GCD, well, I'm going straight to Dyalog APL because
well, you're in a very envious position that you don't actually have to write code in these languages for a living. But I mean, where we want to be is that in 3 years, 4 years, I can't say how long it'll be. You would pick Dyalog APL every time.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Morten, talking about supporting for the companies that use Dyalog APL, has there been any thought about, say, freezing a version and then doing exploration past that for a different version? I guess that means you end up having to support two versions. That's not what you want to do, is that right?
No. I mean, John Scholes did. John Scholes put out a version once that he deliberately based on a 3-version old out of support version of Dyalog APL, where he experimented with closures and functions returning functions and stuff like that. I have this dream, which I don't know whether is realistic. I mean, I don't know if you've looked at our implementation of futures and isolates, but basically in Dyalog APL, an isolate is a namespace which appears to be in your workspace, but if you dot into it and do anything, that's actually processed in another process. And you immediately get a future back as a placeholder. And you can pass that around as an argument to other functions, or make enclosed arrays with hundreds of different futures. And as long as the interpreter doesn't need to know the actual value of the future, you can do what you want. And then when you eventually say, well, display it or add one to it or something, then the interpreter just blocks. And I think that there's an experimental version of J that Henry Rich was involved in, which has something very similar. I mean, the implementation is completely different, but the ideas are similar. What I'm hoping we might do is set up a system where you can have multiple versions of Dyalog APL that are connected together in this fashion. So you might have actually several versions of Dyalog APL, possibly incompatible, all appearing available to you at once. And that would allow us to experiment in a way where users can, they can keep their legacy code all running in the old interpreter. But it's terribly dangerous. As soon as you announce a new version of something, the users get scared, confused, bewildered. They stop doing things until they understand where you're going. We have the one. Let me see. What else have I got on my to-do list before I get into that discussion? So, there's more of the same. And we've got the Codefense compiler, of course, which Aaron has been working on as a research project, and hopefully we can bring that in. And again, this namespace connectivity might be exactly the way we hook that in. In fact, the way Aaron's Codefense compiler currently integrates with Dyalog APL is exactly the same sort of. You give it a namespace, and it compiles the namespace, and you end up with something that looks identical to the APL user as what you had before, but now the functions are being executed by Codefense. So that the namespace idea, which has been in Dyalog APL for a very long time, has proven itself to be adaptable to GUI, object-oriented programming, etc. It's really perhaps the main reason why Dyalog APL is here today, is the existence of namespaces. But anyway, one of the things I have in my notes is this section titled "Avoid Being Seduced by Shiny Things," because you don't want to end up like IP Sharpe Associates, who it's a sad story, right? The APL users were all happily doing personal computing on the mainframe. They didn't feel that the mainframe had any problems, right? Cost, yeah, but backups were taken. It always worked. And then along comes the PC, and everybody else is going wild. Oh wow, now I have my own computing environment. I can do whatever I want. And the APL programs are going, yeah, well, so what? I'm already doing everything I want. What's the point? And as a result, the APL community completely missed the significance of the PC. And suddenly, a guy came along with a cart, took their IBM 3270 terminal and wheeled it off. And they just sat there going, what? And so you want to be aware of what's going on around you so you don't end up there. But you also have to be careful not to move too fast, right? So if you go back to the early 2000s, our main competitor, APL, what were they called at the time? APL 2000. They were told by the US government and so on that if they weren't running entirely managed code in a small number of years, they'd be out of business. So they immediately created a second APL interpreter competing with their existing one, which was based on the .NET CLR. So they had two competing APL interpreters and massive confusion, and they diluted their efforts. And in the end, none of the customers switched to the .NET version. And the old one prevailed, but was now, had lost 5 years relative to Dyalog, who had just pushed on with the version they had. So, that's, and then before that, actually, when Windows went 32-bit, STSC, I think they were called at the time, they put out a 32-bit version of APL Plus based on something Microsoft produced called Win32S, which was a little thing you could add into your Windows system that gave you a preview of the Windows system, the coming 32-bit Windows. And in Europe, all the big banks and insurance companies, the users of APL, had gone for OS2. And purely by accident, Dyalog APL worked in the OS2 16-bit Windows compatibility box, and APL Plus didn't because it was built on this new technology. And there's so many things like that that make me sort of a bit conservative about chasing quickly after new technologies. If you want to be around for a long time, it's better to occasionally appear a little bit slow, particularly because you have a user community who are Luddites essentially. I mean, it's a little bit. I mean, probably the listeners of this podcast and a lot of the new people attracted to APL are actually very much up on functional programming and all the new things that are happening in software engineering. But the people who have had the most benefit from APL through the ages and who pay most of our bills are people who are every kind of engineer other than a software engineer. And they are not interested in rewriting their code unless it's because there's new tax legislation where they have to rewrite their insurance policy computations because it's a legal requirement, and they'll do that in half an hour. But if they have to rewrite it because now there's some new GUI widget library, it really, doesn't turn them on. But anyway, so that was maybe a bit of a rabbit hole there. I mean, there are so many examples of APL vendors chasing after things that turned out to be very expensive. There was a very, very good APL product called Micro APL, which was cross-platform, on the Mac, on Linux, on Windows, and they bet the farm on a particular cross-platform GUI library that disappeared.
That's too bad.
And they just gave up. It was such a big. I don't know, the J people have been doing Qt for a while, and I've been going, is Qt going to survive, and so on. And maybe I called that one wrong. Maybe Qt looks like it's quite strong, actually. It might last forever. Maybe we should look at Qt. Should we look at Windows assembly? Yeah. WebAssembly.
I was just going to say, I'll add that the Micro APL documentation is the best APL documentation.
It is superb.
Only because it's so simple. Like Dialogs is great, but like a lot of the times, if I know it's like an OG, APL symbol, I'll just go and try and find. It's very hard to track down, but if you search Micro APL reduce, that'll always get you to the Micro APL website.
And Rich, as far as I know, we have permission from Richard Nabavi and the Micro APL team to use their documentation as we please.
Oh, is that so?
So you don't, remember that. I'll write to Richard and ask him to be sure, but I'm pretty sure, they essentially gave Micro APL to us to host so that anybody who still wanted it could download it, and it's somewhere on our website. Anyway, I think I've been talking enough. I mean, I have some notes here on interesting discussions like free and open source and backwards compatibility, and is APL a notation or a programming language? And maybe we should return to those later, unless there's one that you would really like to pick off now. I think we have 10 minutes left or something like that.
Yeah, we've just got over, I'd say, 5 to 10 minutes left. I would probably say let's hang on to all those topics, and we'll definitely have you on in a future episode. But in the last few minutes here, maybe we open up to questions. This is one that has hopefully a short answer. You can just say yes, no, or maybe. You mentioned GitHub at one point, and one of the nice things to bring up Smalltalk again was Smalltalk, a similar language in many respects, in that they have the workspace images, and it's hard to adopt that model to GitHub where you're just storing everything in source files, because that's not how Smalltalk and APL work. They did come up with, in their latest Pharo editor, a sort of file format that you can very easily integrate and just say, choose GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, and poof, it'll, you give it a repo, it shows up. Is that something that would ever be possible? Like, I know Tartan.
In 18.2 coming out soon, there's an experimental user command that's a bit overpowered in some senses. It's called get, and it's ostensibly because there's lots of ways to bring different types of either APL source code or data into the workspace, and you need to know which magic incantation is for which. Whereas Get is a kind of wrapper which tries its best to figure out that for you. But it also has a really nice feature, which I'm hoping will allow people to share code quite nicely. You can point it at a GitHub repository or a hosted URL of a workspace, or even a zipped folder, a zip file that contains a linkable set of APL text source, and it will pull that off the internet, unzip it for you, and bring it into your workspace.
Does it do the reverse of being able to push to a GitHub repo?
No. So the two things I know that, well, no, one I know definitely does that is Carlyle Group's Dado Dialog Development Operations thing has Git integrated, but also its packages are entirely like a package is a thing on GitHub, is how it's defined it.
But I think though Connor is looking for something where what's put up on GitHub is text, right? So that it diffs nicely.
No, Get can do that.
So, but so at the moment, our model is that each function or each namespace maybe becomes a single text file. We're not thinking that people really want to write the entire workspace. I mean, we have users who have 100 megabytes of source code that they might load into the workspace, and having that as a single text file is probably not very. Is that what you were asking, Connor?
Well, no, yeah. So it does sound like it's on the horizon, though. That Dyalog is thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, have you looked at this tool we have called Link, which is our current best shot at loading text into a workspace, and then if you ever edit a function, the text file gets updated immediately, and you have a nice folder full of files that you can easily manage on Git.
So I saw the Dyalog 2021 presentation on it, but I have not played around with it yet. So
right, yeah. So yeah, have a look at that and tell me whether you know what's missing from that.
Do we have any final questions from Bob, Rich, or Stephen, or should we just throw it back to Morten?
I think it's been fascinating to hear the history and the background, because it gives me a lot more depth into some of the challenges that you're adapting to, like having the antenna out for things that are changing without having to jump in that direction. Makes perfect sense to me, but it's a really difficult balancing act.
It's really hard, and also as an APL vendor, because you have these non-technical users a lot, they're actually looking for you to be the oracle who decides. They're not going to look at a new technology until we make a quad something that maps to it. Until then, they're going to ignore it. And so they're relying on Dyalog to come along and say when it's time to learn something new. But I mean, it's I'm so grateful, right, that I've been able to essentially get paid to do my hobby for more than, I've been doing happy array programming for 45 years. I did a talk at Functional Conf about APL and sort of a little bit about myself. And then the coffee break, this guy comes up to me and he says, "Are you telling me you've been using the same programming language for more than 35 years and you're still smiling?" Like that was, completely unthinkable. And one of the things I'm really happy with in the time at Dyalog is that we've been able to bring together so many of the people who historically were forced by their corporations to be enemies, right? So the Jim Brown at IBM and Eric Iverson, Ken Iverson, Roger, these people who were at war, and we've been actually able to work with all of them in the last 15 years, and really make use of a lot of the ideas that have been generated, try and bring them together in the same place. And that we managed to get across what I think historically has been a very technologically challenging period from the beginning of GUI until today, where things are sort of starting to settle down, although JavaScript frameworks are still mutating faster than viruses. But, I'm also really hoping that one day I'll be able to sit in my rocking chair and say that I helped, or at least did not hinder, the beginning of careers of the people who will be the great array language implementers of the future. And that's not just the people who are at Dyalog today, but, Nick Nikolov was at Dyalog before he did NGN APL, and Marshall worked for us for a while before he needed to move faster. And it was perhaps a very strange thing to bring up, but I'd like to mention it, even though this is a technical podcast. I'm really hoping that the new generation of APL implementers will also have more gender diversity, because at Dyalog, I think we're developing reasonable cultural diversity, but at the moment, it's still, the girls run the company and the boys tinker with code. And of course, I'm dating myself by only having 2 categories there. But I really hope it'll, become much more inclusive, and we'll see more kinds of people working with APL in the future in general. Yeah. Yeah,
I can completely agree with that. It's a problem that C++ also has. I think a lot of programming languages have. Yeah, IP Sharpe apparently, They got it right, and then something happened along the way.
Yeah, though even at IP Sharpe, the women quickly migrate towards migrate towards management much faster than the boys, and rightly so. They're better at it, but yeah. No, it seems. Yeah, sorry. It seems to me that women demand that there's somehow more meaningful content in what you're doing, whereas the guys are happier to go and chase, the wheels of cars that run past and stuff like that. But hopefully I think it's changing. I mean, that is changing. I believe it is. And
yeah, on that note, so that's a call to action to if you want to write your own programming language. CTO of Dyalog Limited has just said, please go ahead. And
or if you'd like to be a language implementer and you're not one of the boys, give me a call, okay? Because we'll be hiring soon.
Oh yeah, we'll put links in the show notes for not just that, but for everything that we've said in this podcast. But yeah, I guess we did our ArrayCast at contact at ArrayCast.com at the beginning, so. We don't need to say that. So yeah, we'll just say once again, thank you so much, Morten, for coming on. As always with many of our guests, or all of our guests, I should say, we'll definitely want to have you back in the future. And that list of topics you mentioned I'm sure could fill not just one, but a number of podcasts. So we'll definitely have to have you back on. And thank you both to you and Gitte and everyone at Dyalog Limited. I think I've said this before on past podcasts, but I would have never discovered these languages if it hadn't been for Dyalog APL and continuing to carry the torch and setting up the website tryapl.org. It has greatly enhanced my love of programming and programming languages, having discovered APL, and I don't think it would have happened if it hadn't have been for your company. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That makes it all worthwhile.
And with that, I guess we'll say happy array programming.
Happy array programming.